My name is Don Purnell, and I chose sewing for my leisure hobby project. Sewing actually dates back all the way to the Paleolithic era, in which people would use bones as needles, and they would also sew skins for anything they would hunt and sew them together for warmth, and as well as to build any kind of shelter and of sorts. As time went on in the 1800s, it evolved into a strictly women's leisure activity. Young girls were taught by their mothers at very young ages, as young as 6 to 9 years old, and they were sort of taught to tend to the family's wardrobe and maintain all of the, as well as their household chores. And this sort of dovetails with it being primarily a women's activity, because as housewives, they were expected to sew, cook, clean, and maintain the family, while the father or male figure was the breadwinner. Later on in the garment industry, as it would develop, it would actually employ immigrant women of different races and ages for cheap labor. So these women were given jobs with sewing machines or even hand sewing to employ themselves and get some sort of fund going to assist with the home. The skill was handed by mothers and daughters. It was passed on, similar to how perhaps a father's skill set of being a mechanic and one that was passed down to a son, of sort of a torch handed over. Sewing machines, as time went on, when they were invented by a man named Singer, it was specifically targeted for women. So they would use verbiage that would appeal to women. They would even sort of demean women by saying that women of any intelligence would be able to use this machine. At the time, they were invented with sort of a pedal that could be similar to a bass pedal on a drum kit. So they would have to pump their foot while using their hands to sew any kind of garment they were intending to or any project they were doing. As time went on, males would become sewers by participating in the garment industry. And as it went further, marketing would sort of shift their appeal towards men a little bit versus being so predominantly against towards women. As far as ideals for a woman's role, it was family oriented. So all this sewing knowledge went towards for the good of the family as a housewife. Sewing was also a recreational activity in the sense that women would create clubs and share tips and whatnot, and projects and patterns, and they became part of the obligations of home life. So along with all the sort of duties that a woman had while her husband or male figure was tending to their job, the woman would be home, taking care of the children and making sure all of the house is taken care of. My experience in relation to class, I had sort of a lack of appreciation for sewing. For me, this was sort of a way to gain appreciation for the skill that is required, because when you sort of look at sewing, I didn't really understand the full scope of it. And history certainly is portrayed as a women's activity. I knew as a young kid that my mother and grandmother were really all the ones who sew. I saw my dad sew a few patches once in a while, but for the most part, he'd hand over any kind of ripped clothing or anything like that to my mom just so she would take care of it. And I got a great sense of the constraints of gender because of just how predominantly women-oriented it is. I know very few men outside my father who even would know how to sew or even begin how to sew. For my participation, I never really got into it because I just never had an intention to pick up hand sewing. I also didn't have much of an idea of where to start. As far as I knew, that it was similar to what I had read, is that my grandmother has passed on to my mother, and my mother passed it on to my sister. And again, I didn't have a whole lot of exposure growing up to sewing. It was strictly almost a passive experience with my mother doing it. And for me, I just was unaware of how to sew old and tattered clothes. Typically, I would just throw them away and get new ones. For challenges, it was an interesting set. For the first part, it was definitely threading that needle. There was a certain sense of patience in order to thread the tiny hole that was in the needle there. I tried several different sizes of needles, and it was incredibly difficult just to even get the thread there. I tried every aspect of licking the thread, everything like that, and it just would not go through. Keeping neat was another difficulty. You had to do a lot of multitasking, which I hadn't realized, as far as knowing where your hands are at all times, as far as make sure you don't poke yourself, which I did a few times, and luckily it wasn't anything to break the skin or bleed. And there's just a lot of coordination involved as far as knowing where your hands are at all times and where you're sewing and how to keep the clothes straight so that you don't crumple it or sew what you don't want to sew. After I would complete something, you got a definite sense of accomplishment that you sort of had, you took the time, and I renewed whatever clothes I had versus just tossing it away. It was sort of wearable again. This is a photo of me tying that. So I had learned a method from my mom where you sort of wrap the thread around your index finger. And then what you would do is you would roll both ends of the thread around the index finger and then push it off with your middle and thumb. And if you pull back, it would actually instantly tie a knot. So it didn't really have, that part was actually a little difficult for me to grasp because it was essentially a one-handed knot. This is my first project I did. I had split some pants from work. There was a pretty big hole in there near the inner thigh. And essentially I had kept them, luckily, because this had happened after the class had started. And after some time and consumption, you could see there, I was starting to sew the hole there, and there wasn't a whole lot of material to work with. But in the end, it actually came out pretty good, and they're definitely wearable, and now I don't look like sort of a hobo walking around with holes in my pants. So that one was an interesting one. That was before I learned the method of sewing from behind. I sort of sewed on the outside, and it would show up the thread a little more. This was a shirt that I've had for a while that I didn't really want to part with. What happens is that the washer had torn a hole in it. And as such, this is where I learned from my mom to sort of sew from the inside so that the threading doesn't show on the outside. It was a definitely much more cleaner aspect of it that I hadn't really thought about. I was strictly just thinking out, sort of direct, where I would sew where the hole is versus sewing on the inside so that you can kind of hide up any kind of work that was done to it. As far as insights, I definitely had a much larger appreciation for the art in sewing. I hadn't realized how much practice and skill was definitely required. It wasn't something that you could just pick up so easily within a matter of weeks. More men should be more exposed to it so they could realize they could repair their clothing. Even just tiny little holes in socks and whatnot were a fairly fun fix. The intimidating factor is not nearly as bad as I intentionally thought it was. I sort of expected it to be, painful, and it was just something that I actually realized wasn't nearly as bad as my expectations were. And as far as continue, I would definitely continue because I've actually grown to repair a lot of clothing that I had just sitting in my closet, as I'm sort of a stickler for buying new clothes. 4 weeks only allowed so much progress, so I didn't get into the cool art stuff where as far as people were making patterns and whatnot, just spending a lot of time in knitting and sewing on there. And I definitely found more creative ways to repair my clothing on here. And above all else, it was somewhat of a relaxing activity. So I would sort of sit, whether I was watching TV or just on the bed before bed, I would just sort of sew and kind of, it would sort of unwind myself because I'm constantly focused on repairing whatever piece of clothing I was taking care of. And that wraps it up. And thank you for everything, and I appreciate this class. Thank you.